I can't hear anybody. I don't know if that's just me or not.
Hey.
Hey.
Also,
Hey, folks.
Oh, hey, Ivan. Zoom has taken over both of my screens for some reason. But
Zoom's getting real greedy.
Oh, cool. This time we have a recording from the beginning.
Yeah, I set that up. I think I messed it up the first time and people got stuck in some weird mode. So I had to stop and restart it. One fun detail of having it auto record from the beginning is that it catches everybody showing up and us getting to say hello to each other. So if we ever rewatch these videos, the first 5 minutes is just going to be this.
Node.js Foundation also recording videos, and they always starts from, and we live. So they actually start from this phrase, every single video.
Nice. How's everybody doing? It's a wild world out there these days.
Doing well, but childcare is an issue.
I see you there, Matt. I hear you. If you hear any screams in the background, that's my kid.
But it's nice in some ways too.
It's true. Let me make sure I get any last minute pull requests.
Good morning, everyone.
Hey, Rob, how's it doing?
It's going all right. How are you?
Surviving?
Are you feeling a little cooked up yet?
Oh, yeah.
Yvonne, where are you now?
Ukraine. So
Okay.
I returned back from GraphQL Asia.
Is that where the travels ended?
Yeah, so it was a final destination. And actually I had the temperature. I catch some food poisoning in India, so I was flying with temperature. And we're going to a plane. I actually asked them, what should I do? Because I have a temperature and there is like coronavirus stuff, and they say, if you can fly, then fly. So I just fly to Ukraine. It was 3 weeks ago, 1 month ago. Yeah, 1 month ago.
I must admit that I was a little late in taking this whole thing seriously, even after GraphQL Asia, as I was flying through Changi in Singapore. I was like, why is everything shut down? This is not a big deal. This is just a flu. And I was clearly wrong about that.
Yeah. I feel like it all came to a head at the same week that we were gonna, the Linux Foundation has their summit. So all of that got canceled.
Wait, so did you end up going anyway? Because you said you had booked a ski weekend, right?
The whole event got canceled.
Well, right, but you had plans. You were gonna.
Yeah, I didn't go. I was bummed.
Yeah, that's a bummer.
All right, well, it looks like we have a pretty focused group today, which is totally fine. We actually have a pretty healthy agenda to get through too. I guess let's stick to our regular proceedings, even though we have a tight group, and just do names to faces really quick. So hey everyone, hopefully you all know me. I'm Lee. Let me edit my name in here so I don't show up as GraphQL Foundation. And then we'll go down the list in the order. I think Matt, you're up.
All right, yeah.
I'm Matt. Oops, sorry. I'll go first, just and then yeah, I'm Matt. I've been working on the specified by directive, and just here to check in on that.
Michael's not here yet. Mr. Mahoney.
Yeah, okay, I'm the other Matt. I'm Matt Mahoney, work on GraphQL client at Facebook.
Hey everyone, I'm Benji. I work on GraphQL and Graphical when I get a chance. I'm also involved in the input unions, RFC, and a few other things.
Hi, my name is Ivan, and I'm maintaining GraphQL.js. And today I finally released new version 15.0.0. And yeah, so sorry for a long delay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Evan. I run APIs at Shopify and big GraphQL push there right now.
Rob.
I'm Robert Zhu from AWS. Yeah, that's it.
All right, I'm Morris from IBM, working on a GraphQL proxy in the middleware.
I'm Mike. I'm gonna have to duck out a little early here, but just wanted to kind of sit in while I can here on the side. Not currently working on anything, but now that 15 is out, hopefully I'll get the chance to start doing some major TypeScript refactors to the reference implementation.
Oh, that would be awesome. All right, welcome all. As a reminder, we all, by joining here, agree to the Spec membership agreement, participation guidelines, and code of conduct. Links are there in the agenda if you need a refresher. Otherwise, just a reminder. And also, I edited the template this time around in the big bold text on attendees, saying that you all consent to being recorded by joining. So we started recording by default when this thing booted up. So hopefully that makes things easier. Although we still need to go dig out where all these videos end up on the cloud. Quick review of the agenda so we know what we're talking about today. We're going to do a quick dive into the annual report. We'll check up on custom scalars, input unions, the application GraphQL Mime type. And that's our tight agenda. Anything else people want to dive into? Okay. I feel like we can actually, some of these are marked as 5 minutes. I feel like that might be ambitious. Let's take a minute to check out this annual report. This looks like it was done by me, but the vast majority of the credit here goes to Brian and Chris, who put this whole thing together and basically just asked me to write a look ahead synopsis for the ends. That's really my only contribution. If you haven't checked this thing out yet, you absolutely should. It's really, really good. You should share it out. Share it amongst your companies too. I think that's pretty helpful. The hope is that folks will see this and want to join as new members of the foundation. But sorry, someone trying to chime in.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about the membership. I know things have been evolving on that front, particularly for smaller people. I know you've got a thing like pre-approved. I read the report earlier. Pre-approved open source projects and such. I know that, I think anyway, that to become a GraphQL Foundation member, you need to be a Linux Foundation member. Is that correct?
No, the GraphQL Foundation is backed by the Linux Foundation, and so most of our paperwork mirrors theirs. But the Linux Foundation is a little bit confusing because there's the Linux Foundation, which is the foundation that operates Linux, and then there's the Linux Foundation, which is this overarching thing that has dozens, if not hundreds, of projects. And we're part of that like overall set. So we don't have anything to do with the more specific Linux Foundation. And so when you join, the funding that you contribute goes towards GraphQL Foundation specific pool. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think there was confusion, like when the GraphQL Foundation started out, that you needed to pay the membership fee to the GraphQL Foundation and also a membership fee to the Linux Foundation. But
That's certainly confusing.
Sounds like that might not be the case.
No, I mean, we pay the Linux Foundation for some services, but there should be like a one. You're paying the GraphQL Foundation, but like we use them as they're the ones who operate all of the funding pathways, which is maybe why that's confusing, because like technically the money goes to them. I don't know. It's kind of like, you check out in a Shopify flow. You're paying Shopify, but like that money goes to the vendor. Kind of similar. It is a little bit confusing.
Got it. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah. Did other folks get a chance to check this out? Any thoughts, questions, ideas, concerns?
Yeah, Robert here. I have one thought on the AWS side. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many GraphQL use cases across Amazon, and unfortunately what we did this time was only highlight the cases related to Amplify. And what I'll be working on over the next few months is gathering some of the cases that we're using GraphQL for across Amazon. It's some really, really cool cases that I bet you're all using today. But there's some process to get all that approved and for legal to take a look at it all. Ideally, next time we send out one of these newsletters, people will realize that AWS or Amazon is one of the biggest GraphQL clients out there.
Very cool. Anybody else have thoughts?
Sorry, Robert, was that Amplify or AppSync you were saying for the notes?
Yeah, AppSync is part of Amplify. It is part of the Amplify product suite, so to say. But a GraphQL use case is not just within Amplify by any means.
Thanks.
All right. Well, I'm happy to see that come together. Pretty exciting that the foundation is 1 year old. Doesn't mean a whole ton to this group since we operate as an open group, but it has given us some solid backing and helped add a little bit of process. Like having the Zoom membership is pretty great. That's one way we benefit. Okay, next up is custom scalars. Matt, Evan, you want to update us on where we are?
Yeah, we largely the same place we were at the last meeting. We're waiting on the implementation to land in GraphQL.js. That was paused while Ivan had some things, but I saw some comments on that about an hour ago, so I think we're moving forward again on that. Yeah, otherwise I don't think there's much to do there. Once the implementation lands, then we can start things moving again. This one really is only going to be 5 minutes, unless other people have comments.
So from my side, yeah, overdue review process. Basically, I released 15.0.0. So in a week, I want to release a new feature release. Just wait if somebody discovers some breaking change or something, because there is a lot of changes in this release. So and I will try to finish review today. I left a couple of comments. Most of them is not principal. One thing I want to discuss, if we have time for it, it's not in a spec, but we have a list of breaking changes. What's considered a breaking change? In GraphQL.js, we have a function called find breaking changes. So
you mean schema breaking changes?
Yeah, schema breaking. So I have a question. If we change URL on a Scalar, specified by URL on a Scalar, technically it's like a breaking change because it's an identifier on the client side, and client can like do something with it, like type mapping or something like that. Should we treat it like a breaking change or not?
I'd say it might not be a breaking change, right? Because it could be the same document at a different URL, or it could be a looser definition of the same specification. So I think it's complicated, right?
Yeah, if we treat URL as machine readable, any change to URL change how it's interpreted on the client. So for example, you have you mapping URL to type in Java. You map datetime URL for datetime RFC to Java datetime type. So if we change URL, even if it's reference the same document, like client implementation, for client implementation, it's breaking change, even if it's breaking change for developer.
Yeah, it seemed, taking those two comments together, I think it's fair to say we don't know what it really means when the string changes or when the URL changes. So it could not be a breaking change. It could be pointing to two different Java classes with the same implementation or something that will always validate the same scalar. Or it could really be a major breaking change and break people, right? And we just don't know.
Yeah, we also have to unpack what we mean by breaking. I think this is probably a mistake on my part, and Matt and I have worked together on the breaking change stuff for a long time, or a long time ago, I guess. And we mixed them all into one pot. But really, there's very different categories of breaking changes. There's the idea of if you take the same query, like the same text of a query, and then sent it to a server after this change had been applied, will you get back something meaningfully different, or will that query no longer be valid or not execute anymore? And those are like truly a schema breaking change because you've made a past query present a result that's no longer the same. So this idea of like backwards compatibility breaking change. That one is not, like, none of these are represented in the spec. I think that one is the highest value to be like clearly defined of what is and is not schema backwards breaking change. Because the breaking change tool in GraphQL JS also includes this other category of things just called dangerous change, which is not breaking, but is not really super clear on what it means by dangerous. Because there's this second bucket of things, which is there's this whole ecosystem of client-side tooling, which relies on introspection to do stuff. And if you change those things in some way, then the client-side tooling could cause someone a headache in a serious way. You know, it could generate a new artifact in a way that requires some manual intervention. It could break an existing one. It could generate code that looks fine but doesn't compile. So there's like all these things that are very specific to the particular tool. And so I know the code generation that we had built at Facebook, a lot of those dangerous change rules came out of what would or wouldn't break those. So those it's not perfect, but you can kind of think of them as like forward breaking changes because your clients are gonna eventually pick up those schema changes and try to do stuff with new queries. It's not a perfect way to think about it, but that's how I've thought about it in the past, is like those two buckets of things. I don't know if that helps answer this particular question.
I think that's really helpful, but I think this particular one is both in the first the more extreme category and in the doesn't matter at all, right? Like the new URL could really mean the exact same type. It's just a better documentation source for that same type or whatever, right? Or it could be one of them is positive integer and one of them is negative integer, and everything that used to be valid is not valid anymore.
I think sorry, I think from what we said so far, we were going to treat the identifier as opaque. So in my mind, if the identifier changes, then we never actually go and fetch that. We never look at the thing. We can't tell. So we just have to assume it's a breaking change. If the client is using a map to look up behavior based on the value has changed, and thus the behavior would change. It may mean something completely different. It may not. We don't know.
I kind of agree with Lee. Thanks for clarification, because it's like usually clients don't fetch introspection in production. So if you use code generation, you fetched URL during build time. And when you compile your app and deploy it to App Store and it's working, it's not querying your GraphQL API for URL. It's just like already compiled inside the app. So for most cases, yeah, I agree with Lee. It's not like first category of breaking changes. So like practically wise, I just want to raise this issue and not to deviate discussion. So since we have like, we don't have unified opinion, I think like we can just keep this issue for now. And if somebody raises this issue later, we can have a separate discussion. So based on practice, if somebody will create a PR for GraphQL.js trying to edit as breaking change, I think we can renew discussion and yeah.
Should we take a stab at trying to document the different kinds of breaking changes?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a gap that this is not covered by the spec, because it means that anyone trying to build a tool that detects schema breaking changes needs to go like surf around and find existing tools and port them, and then like gut check if they are correct or not, which is not a great process. Matt, you raised your hand. What's up?
Yeah, so with this, even some of our breaking changes that are currently categorized in the first category are not necessarily always breaking changes. For instance, changing a type to be an interface, that is right now, like based on our validation rules, I believe that that's in category 1. It's considered a breaking change, but almost all clients, like the query that you run against the server, you'll on the client treat the interface that you got as a type, but you'll be able to deal with it.
I think that one is if you query for underscore type name.
Yes.
That value would change.
Get a different type name back, but if you had a type, it was silly of you to query for type name. And if you're querying for type name, you're anticipating this getting upgraded to an interface or whatever. And you should be able, like, the type of type name hasn't changed.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
Yeah. So even basically my point is, even our existing rules are not super well, like even the ones that we are currently level 1 aren't as well categorized as they could be.
Yeah, I think what's missing is definitional rigor to what it means to be a breaking change. And there's just a bunch of open questions. And we haven't been very rigorous about how we categorize those things. So I think it's a huge opportunity if anyone's interested in taking a stab at this, even just kind of like framing up the problem. I think that's a valuable step forward for the spec. I do think this is like one of the biggest missing parts. It's something people trip on a lot, is how to detect breaking changes and understand the rules. Because like even us as a group that meets regularly to discuss GraphQL have more questions than answers about this. That probably means that everybody else is the same, if not worse off. Circling back to the agenda item, specifically for the custom scalar spec, so as I understand, this is purely just waiting on getting merged and released, and that's the final thing to kind of gut check that the implementation matches the spec as written for us to move it to its final stage. Cool. Yvonne, what do you recommend for code review in the future? I feel like this has been a bit of a pain point. Do you need additional hands in doing code review in the GraphQL JS code base, or is this just purely like a serialization issue of needing to get 15 out first?
It was mostly like, it was a really crazy month for me. So yeah, it's mostly like 15.0.0, and yeah, I need like actually reviews are really helpful, and answering questions on GraphQL JS is also really helpful. So like some of the items doesn't require like deep knowledge of like code base. So yeah, I'm always happy to if somebody discovers something for me. And also right now, like we can add custom ESLint rules. So I will try to put, like, for example, we hit 100% coverage. So right now I don't need to say to people like, you're not covering this line or this line, because yeah, it's like code coverage gives them report. So it's twofold issue. One fold is would be really nice if somebody reviews. And second thing, I think I need to invest more in tooling. Yeah, like GitHub Actions and other stuff.
Okay. I don't have answers, but I just wanted to make sure I understood. Anything else we should talk about on this topic before we move on? Cool. Let's talk about the input unions RFC. Vince is not here, so Evan, I'll let you.
Yeah, it's
piece.
similar kind of meta point to the previous one. Of at the last working group meeting, I believe we decided that we should have a kind of a separate breakout session with all of the champions of the various solutions that had been proposed for input unions, and then that didn't happen because logistics. And I mean, it's been a crazy month and a half, so like not terribly worrying or surprising from a kind of grand organizational perspective, but just to point out that we should try again at that probably, yep. or find some other approach to solving that problem.
Yeah, I agree. We need to put like hard dates on this, otherwise progress is going to crawl. Just kind of candidly, I feel like I don't have enough of my own time and attention to give to this to help push it along. So if I could make a request, it's that either you or Vince, whoever wants to kind of pick up as champion. I think the most important next phase is scheduling those things and like hounding people to show up. You know, if people want to champion individual proposals and aren't showing up to meetings that aren't scheduled, then like that's a different problem that we can address. But if it's just that we're not setting up the meetings in the first place and talking about this stuff, then we need to either change process or
there was a time for a meeting proposed in the GitHub ticket, but not everybody responded, notably you.
Okay, shit. Well, that's on me.
But we can, yeah, I'll coordinate with Vince and we'll definitely kind of firm up a date and say this is the day, and hope that it works for everybody.
Here's another idea. What do you think about setting up a channel in the Slack? That way we can like start kicking at this asynchronously and like have a dedicated channel.
Yeah, that would also work.
Right.
Which Slack? I have like a million Slacks now.
The GraphQL Slack.
Okay, just the regular GraphQL Slack. There isn't like a GraphQL working group Slack or anything.
There's a working group channel in the GraphQL Slack.
Did not know that.
Which yeah, if folks are not in that, just like ping me, DM me in that Slack. That way I know what your username is in there, and I'll add you.
What is the name of that channel?
One sec, let me pull it up. I have too many windows open. That one, I think it's just called WG. Yeah, Benji joined. It's a public channel, and Benji and I are the only ones in it.
Okay, I'll look it up after this.
Yeah, I think I made the channel and then didn't do anything. So did I do that before the last meeting? I feel like I must have mentioned that. Anyhow, I'm hoping actually to get more kind of like chattiness happening on the Slack. There's a very healthy amount of chatting happening amongst a handful of the graphical folks. Orta in particular, Akao. So like those folks are chatting back and forth about the summer of code and how to get graphical involved. So there's some decent discussion happening there. I think as like a general community point, it's a little bit lacking, but I think for like a focused team, it works pretty well. And that can certainly be like the core set of us that were regularly in working group meetings. And or actually anyone can feel free to make a thread. If someone doesn't, I'll do it. But we can set up a public thread to dig into input unions in particular, and use that to both schedule something. Because I think the part of the reason why I'm bad at responding to stuff on GitHub is I have enough open source projects up there that I get on the order of 100 emails a day from GitHub. And so it's impossible for me to tell the difference between what's important and what's not. And as a consequence, I just miss stuff, which sounds like an excuse. It shouldn't be. I'm sorry for missing that stuff, but a little bit of context into maybe why I often miss those things.
No, that's fair. Slack sounds like a better medium for this then.
Cool. I was also going to suggest that we use some of our time today to dig in deeply, but since Vince isn't here today, maybe that's not the best use of time. Anybody else have thoughts on input unions?
I have like one thought. So we discussed it multiple times, and what I saw during previous discussions is like even Vince said he thinks like there is a bunch of solutions, but to this problem, but he feel like one-off should be added anyway. So actually, like think more and more people agreeing that one-off is useful mechanism on its own, even if it's not solving the entire issue. So I think like another direction we can take in this channel or in special meeting is to discuss if we all agree that one-off is a good solution on its own, even if it's not covering the entire problem space.
It would be one of the cheapest to implement, I have to say. So it would be a quick win. No, what I mean is you don't have to change a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, small surface area changed. I don't disagree, but my chief concern is presenting multiple ways to do the same thing. And that's not to say that we should not do that anyway, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves and follow that path before we know that it's wise.
Yeah, one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that people discussed also, and I think it was part of Benji original idea, is to have like a variant type and start from input types, but also think about output types. So I think variant types are useful on its own, or in some languages they call the enum types, like I think in Rust they call the enum. They have different type of enum types, and they can have enum values can have values on its own. So it's like boxed. So I start thinking that variant types are useful on its own, and it can solve another problem that we have with mutations. When people want to have errors and data as response of mutation for validation errors. So I didn't formulate anything particular in my mind, just idea to share. So yeah, maybe somebody else have like pros and cons and stuff. Just something to think before this next dedicated meeting.
Yeah, that's a good point. Definitely a compelling direction. Other thoughts on input unions at the moment? Okay. Well, hopefully we can get a channel up in our Slack and get at least a little bit of async discussion happening. That's more high signal, and also use that to schedule a meeting to dig into the stuff in detail. I saw your message, Benji, about Octobox. I'll check that out. All right, cool. Next on our agenda is application GraphQL media type. Benji, you added this. Do you want to kick us off?
I did. Does someone else want to take notes so that I can think about talking? So we have, we've used this, we've kicked around the application GraphQL media type a lot. We use it, we've referenced it in the serving over HTTP. Loads of people support it. It is referring to sending the actual GraphQL query text itself to the server. As part of the GraphQL over HTTP working group, we're trying to discuss what actually we need to do with regard to actually turning that serving over HTTP mini article into an actual specification. And as part of that, we want to make sure that things like this are nailed down. And of course, we're using application/GraphQL, but it's not actually registered in the IANA media type library, where I think it should be. I know it's also been discussed quite a lot. There's also derivative types. So for example, the response type for a GraphQL request over HTTP is typically, not always, but typically JSON. But it is also JSON with constraints, right? It's constraints that it adheres to the spec. It has the data and errors. We've even specified that it has the extensions field and shouldn't have any other further fields. So it's not just generic JSON, it is a specific thing. And there is the ability in the IANA media types to be able to say things like application/GraphQL plus JSON. So it's effectively saying this is a JSON form of GraphQL application type or something like that. Now, I'm not super familiar with these things. So really, I'm just starting to explore these a little bit. But what I'm keen to know is, A, does anyone else here know a lot more about this stuff than I do, which is very little? And B, what is the status of the various things that we've done about application/GraphQL anywhere? Like, I struggled using Google to track down any particular specification that we've got for this. I can find it in the GraphQL JS tests, for example, and Express GraphQL, and in fact in GraphQL Java and a whole bunch of other libraries, but there's no like concrete single place that defines it yet, as far as I'm aware. So is anyone else aware of that kind of thing?
I'm only aware of the places that you mentioned it. My piece on the MIME types is that we should treat them as a solution to a problem. And so if we have something where like, dang, if only we had a MIME type, like this would be way easier to do, then like, great, we should pitch a MIME type. Otherwise, my biggest gripe about MIME types is that there's like a freaking million of them. And if you have anything that needs to deal with MIME types, you have to like figure out how to parse that thing, and you don't know how to address 99.99% of them anyway. And so it ends up actually like not being a particularly useful thing. And my hope is that we could build out the GraphQL over HTTP spec completely on top of existing HTTP and JSON types. And I don't know enough to have like a strong opinion, but I question whether the plus JSON style MIME type is valuable or not. That might kind of like make its way down all the way to server-side tools and anything that's actually dealing with MIME types. Like, do they handle that plus JSON and then just like throw away the thing that comes before the plus and treat it as JSON? What are they doing with it, or is it actually a headache for them? My hope is like that. I think the goal of a spec like that should be to remove headaches. So if that's something that's preferable, then we should go for it. If it's something that makes people who have to deal with MIME types grumpy, then we should avoid it. That's my only thought on it. What other people think?
I mean, that's great input. So let me tell you about the headache that we are currently solving, which is why we're discussing this. And that is HTTP status codes. Hooray! So basically what we're saying so far in the GraphQL over HTTP spec working group is an API that responds just entirely with GraphQL 200 errors, no matter what the hell happens, is a perfectly valid GraphQL API. That is fine. However, some GraphQL APIs do respond with other status codes, and that is also fine in certain circumstances. And what we're trying to do is to nail down what those circumstances are. So what we've basically said so far is if you get to the execution step of GraphQL, so you've done the validation, you've done all the rest of that, and you know everything's good, and you can start executing it, but like one of your resolvers throws an error or something like that, that should absolutely be a 200 status code. That is like, we have successfully failed to execute this thing for you.
Well, I like to think of it as there's a try catch somewhere down there, and the catch caught the try, and so the whole thing still worked, but like a little piece hit a catch block.
Absolutely. The problem that we have is what happens before then. So for example, if you send a request where the GraphQL query itself is not valid, maybe it's syntactically not valid, maybe it purely just doesn't validate against the schema, some servers will respond with a 400 during that, and I believe that that's a perfectly valid thing to do. The problem then comes, of course, there are other things that happen in the HTTP layers that also give non-200 status codes. So you might have rate limiting, you might have permission denied to even talk to this API. When you have those things, they may well respond with HTML, a forbidden page. They may respond with JSON. That JSON may not be in GraphQL compatible format. So it might be a JSON object that's coming from an intermediary server, some kind of proxy that does protections against your API. And we can't know whether to treat that response as a valid GraphQL response with the errors object or not. We can do it by sort of sniffing and going, well, it looks like it's the right shape, so yeah, maybe. But this is where something like application/GraphQL plus JSON would say, this is concretely a GraphQL response to your query, even though it has a non-200 status code, and you can rely on this. And what we're potentially saying at the moment is, if we get a non-200 status code, then we just assume that it's an error, and we basically say the client shouldn't treat this as a valid GraphQL response unless they know better. And one of the ways to know better would be with a media type.
That's compelling. Yep, I like that.
There is like even use cases without HTTP involved, because in Mime database you associate extension. So in like operation system you can associate program with this extension, and like there is a bunch of other even non-HTTP cases depending on Mime types. Also, it's like if you open DevTools, it's really cool to sort and see GraphQL queries separately sorted as a group. I have some context on how to, because I was involved in with OpenAPI Swagger previously, and they tried to, at least they discussed documenting Mime type. It's not as simple, but at the same time not as hard. Technically, you need to publish RFC, official RFC in official format to be able to claim Mime type outside of vendor zone. So you have special vendor zone, but outside of vendor zone, you basically need to write RFC. It can be separate RFC that just reference our spec. There is a good example. Some person wrote RFC for BMP type, and it doesn't contain description of BMP format. It just say like, this is RFC to document Mime type for BMP format, but they ask also for some required sections. For example, security consideration. So it's required. So we need to write security consideration section for GraphQL. So there is a bunch of like small details. It's not as simple as writing an email to somebody. It's like entire process of claiming. There is like loophole actually. You can publish informal RFC because RFC have different statuses. Informal one, basically, with organization just review your grammar and your English. They don't review content of a document, but it's still possible to claim Mime type with informal RFC. So it's possible, but somebody need to invest like big number of hours in doing that and learn with XML format for doing RFC properly, because it's a lot of bureaucracy. It's one point. Another point about, I'm actually thinking we need to figure out GraphQL over HTTP before we claim Mime type. Because when we claim Mime type and people start using it, it's a point of no return. We cannot redefine what this Mime type mean. So I would first like figure out GraphQL over HTTP, and as we agreed, first version would be like everybody is compatible, and when like gather all the vendors, figure out what we can change, and Mime type can be good feature flag. So we can actually do some like more or less breaking changes, saying if you, for example, like Benji, I remember your proposal was to add extension field to request, And for response, we forbid any other field except like extension, errors, and data. So everything should go into extensions. For requests, we don't have extensions, and vendors right now put like bunch of fields directly on top level. So if we claim Mime type right now, we're basically losing possibility to force everybody to use extension subfield and put like the extension inside it. I don't say it's like necessary stuff that we want, but I think it's very valuable what we document under with Mime type. So we need to really be sure before like pulling the trigger.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And really, we're still just at the research phase for this. And it's really a way of trying to solve when is it valid to treat a non-200 status code as GraphQL. And that's the problem that we're trying to deal with at the moment. Separately, if I can just change the subject slightly and talk about the GraphQL HTTP working group. One other thing that we've stated, which I just wanted to run by the working group here, is that basically any other 200 status code, 2xx status code that is not 200 is invalid, just straight off the bat. So like 201 created doesn't make sense to use because that's a field concern within the GraphQL schema. You may run more than one mutation. It shouldn't make sense. I think it's sort of leaking beyond the bounds of the GraphQL. So I just wanted to state that we've got this. So if anyone has any complaints, come on over to the GraphQL HTTP working group and tell us why we're wrong.
Okay, I will do it. Ietf, for example, can answer you're not changed. I forget which number it is, but we shouldn't prevent people from using Etags together with queries or other caching mechanisms. So not changed, for example, is perfectly valid. So I'm for allowing any kind of 200 codes to be returned.
Certainly,
Yeah,
good point. I see that as being a before the GraphQL bit, but yeah, sure.
But to your point about sometimes it's hard to know what's before that. You know, if you're putting layers in front of your GraphQL server, those might have their own codes. Does that make it not a GraphQL server anymore? Like, there's some complication there. But your general guideline, I think, is sound. Maybe another way you can frame it is describe each HTTP code that does make sense, and then say any HTTP code not referenced here has undefined behavior according to the spec. So you just like leave that explicitly out rather than explicitly banning it. Might be another approach, but I like the shape of what you're talking about.
And then I might have misheard this, but it sounded like you were going to be able to send up an application in GraphQL, but also get back application in GraphQL plus JSON. I think you actually need two different Mime types there, right? Because one is a subset of JSON and the other one is a string of text, right? So I think there's actually two Mime types.
Yeah, there absolutely is. And potentially also a third Mime type as well, because there's also the JSON format that you send to the server as opposed to the one that you get back, the query variables operation name. So I don't know whether those would potentially be the same Mime type and you just know which direction you're talking, or whether they would need separate ones. But the application / GraphQL is the textual format, which is definitely different from the JSON one.
Sending one, maybe you don't have the same problem. I see why a Mime type is valuable for receiving, knowing the difference between some arbitrary layers JSON payload and the actual GraphQL server's JSON payload. But sending, do you still have that same problem? Like, do you need to be able to say, I'm sending you something different looking? I also question whether the application GraphQL Mime type, just as like a text string of GraphQL, is a thing that we should include in the HTTP spec because it doesn't have a place for you to include variables. And that transition seems kind of confusing. Like if later you decide, oh, right, I need a variable here, and now you realize you have to completely change your request format.
We currently, in the spec, we've written up the variables coming through the query string for that, which I believe is a fairly common practice that's already in use.
Query string, but then post body for the, or
yeah. The query string gets the variables in JSON format in a query in a variables equals parameter. It's certainly an interesting communication method. There are people that are using that, so
yeah,
I'm actually quite open to just not standardizing that at all and just only standardizing the JSON communication methods. It would certainly make the spec simpler and saying there is this other way, but that's kind of, you know, vendor specific or whatever. What do you think on that, Lee?
Seems reasonable with me. Evan, you were gonna chime in.
Yeah, as I was going to say, like we do the same thing. We Shopify's public GraphQL API accepts variables as a param, as a query string param, or and the GraphQL application / GraphQL Mime type, and that's what we accept. So I think from what I've seen in the wild, that's pretty standard already, even if it's not actually formalized anywhere.
Okay. You mean you accept that as the only thing you accept, or you accept that in addition to a JSON payload?
We might also accept a JSON payload. I would have to check, but certainly what we see usage of is the application GraphQL Mime type.
Yeah, but I mean, most of the servers have both the GET request with the query params and the POST request. So
this is a little bit between the two, right? This would be a POST request where the URL you're posting to has query params that provide variables.
Oh,
but then the body of the post is application GraphQL. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. You're posting a text string rather than posting a JSON object.
Okay, then I misunderstood. Sorry.
I think there is definitely a lot of combinations here, and it would be maybe good to figure out which ones we want and formalize on that. Although there's a lot of stuff in the wild already.
Mm-hmm.
Can I also jump in here with another requirement that I've seen in this HTTP space? A while ago, it used to be common that enterprises would block the post request at the firewall layer for various reasons. And so if you look at what WCF does, it has to smuggle everything over HTTP GETs. And if that's another operating profile that we want to be able to support, then it further increases the number of variations here. I wonder if this is something that is worth resurrecting one of my old ideas about supporting some sort of capabilities query at the HTTP layer. I don't think this belongs in the official GraphQL spec, but something that says, like, you know, it's clear that what we're talking about, any one of the combinations of these things could work, right? We could say all GraphQL operations have to happen over HTTP post. Errors at the GraphQL level will result in HTTP status code 200 because the request successfully made it to GraphQL, and we're treating HTTP merely as a transport, right? So we could do that. This is hypothetical. I'm not saying that this is a good solution. I'm just using as one example. But that example forms, let's call it a profile. And any other combination of behaviors of HTTP verbs and status codes and what have you could form another profile. And which one of these you use could be defined within it's just like what we do with @specified_by, right? If we imagine that at the HTTP spec level, you have the ability to issue a standard query at a particularly well-known route, and it just tells you which profile you're using. That way we're unambiguous about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Robert. We've been discussing this a fair amount in the HTTP working group as well, indicating like all sorts of like, have you implemented persisted queries? And if so, in which flavor? And so on and so forth, and saying what things are supported and potentially even including what things you're using. But this is all post 1.0 because the 1.0 for the HTTP spec is intended to basically nail down what is the current status, what the 99% of GraphQL communications over HTTP are doing. so that we can have a standard base that everyone can build clients off of in order to then move forwards. And we absolutely want to indicate things like, optional support for particular, other extensions to the protocol. But that is a later concern. We just want to cover the lowest common denominator stuff currently.
Gotcha.
There is something interesting here, though. Oh, sorry, was someone else going to chime in?
Yeah, I have suggestion. Can some vendors collect statistics? If, because usually people implement stuff because other implemented stuff. So if Shopify implement with like post with query parameters, other vendors see like they need to implement it. But for me, the most important question, what way of sending queries developers are using, client developers. So like it would be interesting to have statistics. If nobody using with method of post with query parameters, or it's like couple of percentage of traffic. So I don't think we need to standardize it. On the other hand, it can surprise us, and people for some reason love to use it. So in that case, we absolutely need to document it. So I think it should be, if possible, it would be great to measure statistics for what people are using, especially for public APIs, because for private APIs, it's easy what people agreed inside the company, but for public APIs, I think it would be valuable.
I can definitely pull some stats on what percentage of the different formats we're seeing on Shopify's public APIs. Not this instant, but for the next meeting for sure.
It's a cool idea. I like it. I mean, even if that stat is relatively low, I agree that it's still worth documenting it so that people who are using it, maybe it's just a question of what's required or optional in the spec. Like if you say, I am a GraphQL HTTP server, which of these modes are you required to support and which ones are optionally supported? I like Rob's idea of having some way to document these things at like an options query or something like that. I definitely understand the desire to be limited in the first draft. I think that makes sense, though. We might still want a mechanism even then to be able to just like ask a server, like, do you conform to the spec? And it should be able to tell you if it does or does not. And so some way to know that alone would be pretty useful. And maybe that's the same mechanism. But having something that's extendable there, I think would be super valuable, so that as we do more things like server, like also include ways to upgrade your connection to support subscriptions. There's like a handoff thing you can do to various different pub/sub channels, or like the discussion for streaming APIs, knowing if a server even supports a streamed API kind of before you start talking to it. Having some mechanism that we can start to expose those things over time, and other stuff that we like haven't even been talking about yet. Presumably in the future, you will want some way to say, my server supports this at the HTTP level or at the transport level. So I'm not sure if you've given a ton of thought to that process yet, but it does seem valuable.
Yeah, we have one of the people on the spec group is Jaden Serick, who's behind the GraphQL upload features for uploading through GraphQL fields. So that, of course, needs a whole, like, doing things in a different way than most of the servers work currently. So we would like to indicate that this server supports that and things like that as well. So it's definitely something that's being discussed, but as I say, one of the main aims of this initial spec is to effectively retroactively specify how all existing GraphQL servers work, rather than saying how they will work in future, which I think will be like the 1.1, and we're very, very keen on, but we need the 1.0 out first.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad that you have that focus. That's the right thing to be focused on. Cool. Anything else that we didn't cover in the Mime type discussion?
No, I think that's it. Ivan seems to have a bit of experience with the RFC process at least, so we may pick his brains at some point. But yeah, I think that's enough for us to know for now. If anyone uses non-200 status codes for handling errors and has thoughts on how we might go about, or has seen this in the wider ecosystem and wants to suggest how we could formalize that, or whether it's okay to just say any 400, 500 status codes, we just go, there was an error, and we stop there from a client perspective, and it's up to the client then to do a vendor-specific agreement to say, when it's from this server, then we can process it more or whatever. Because the spec's meant to be generic, I think we can just basically say, if it's 400, 500, we don't know. Unless something else, and we don't know what that is yet. Maybe a header.
There is like edge case for, so usually if query starts executing, we always return to 100, except one edge case. It's in Express GraphQL. I'm not sure about Apollo server, but in Express GraphQL, if error propagation hit top level, so it's like everything is non-nullable in a chain, and it's hit like data, so you cannot provide any data at all, and you break in contract, and this mean we return, I think, like 500. I need to check, but I think it's 500. And it's a tricky question. People constantly open issue about it, but it's not so easy, because when you have a query and you use like CodeGen or other tools, you trust that data will always conform certain shape. So if certain field, so data is always like present, and it's always like an object, and it's have all non-nullable fields. If error propagation hit top level, it's mean like you cannot provide any data at all. And I don't know, like personally, I'm on the fence with this one. I see pros and cons, but like it's complicated question. At least Express GraphQL using it, and I expect like some other servers using it. So yeah, there is edge cases.
The GraphQL spec allows data to be present but null in the response. That's not a spec violation.
Yeah, but this one is the case where data is not present because the top level is not nullable, or the top level field is not nullable.
But that should still result in null data though, right? So you're saying a field on the query object, for example, were to be not nullable and were to throw, then effectively the query object itself would be the catch for that. And the schema gets given the query type. It doesn't get given a not nullable query type, for example. So I think the query type itself is nullable. So then data would be null because that represents the query type, I think. But I'm not sure.
That was my understanding.
Yes.
That's certainly how Shopify's API behaves in practice.
We should
It's
probably
wrong,
double check.
I should know, but.
Yeah, no, you're right. I'm looking it up in the spec now. If an error was encountered during the execution that prevented a valid response, the data entry in the response should be null. If an error is encountered before execution begins, the data entry should not be present in the result. So the data key not being present means that you encountered an error during, like it either was not syntactically valid or it failed validation. And the data entry being null means that execution was attempted but failed. But to Ivan's point, then the question is, what is the correct HTTP status code for such a result? The Express GraphQL is non-200 for this. My opinion is that is the correct response. My mental model for how this works is like try catch. So you have fields that are able to catch errors and convert them into a valid null result. But the data level is like, that's not a GraphQL field, right? That's a top level, that's just like formatting the result of the entire payload. And so what does it mean for your entire top level result to be null? And I think the only way to think about that is there was an error and there was no try catch that could catch it. And so it propagated all the way to the top, and therefore you should treat it as a top level error. That was at least the thinking behind why Express GraphQL presents non-200 in that scenario.
That makes sense. Would you then say that an API that responds with a 200 status with the data null would be non-compliant, or is that still valid? You just don't care what the status code is in that situation?
Say that again.
So because we're trying to specify everything, one of the things we've said is if you just always return with the 200, you are valid. And I want to make sure that that is okay. So like if it's a validation error and you've got an errors object, you know, you've not got data, you've only got errors, and you give that back to the client over a 200, is that something that we should allow in the GraphQL HTTP spec?
My sense is no. I think we should have pretty firm rules about which code means what in which scenarios. I think we should reserve a 200 only for the scenario where the query was syntactically valid, it passed validation, it executed, and some data was appropriately returned as a result. Like at least the top level query object was returned. So the data field is non-null. That entire pipe results in a 200.
So that means if the query validation fails, so if one of the query validation rules fails, we return something else than 200?
Yeah, so if your query is syntactically incorrect or it fails query validation, then it should return a 400 level error, client side error, because the request as you sent it was not possible to execute.
What would that do in the case of a batch?
In the case of a batch, I mean, that depends on how we define batch APIs. I know Facebook's batch API will return a set of status code and response payloads. So you'll see like this endpoint was a 200 with this payload, that endpoint was a 400 with this payload, and you'll get the full results that way. But
yeah, I think that's what we've discussed so far, that for batching, assuming the batch itself was able to execute, you get a 200 for the batch, and then each individual entry would get its own status codes, just as you've described. But batching is not something that we're going to do in our version 1 spec. That would be an extension in a later version. So what you're suggesting at the moment, Lee, is a much stronger form of the status codes than what we were currently proposing in the HTTP spec, which is perfectly fine. Most of us on the HTTP spec are in agreement with what those error codes should be, like 400 for failed validation and things like that. But there are servers out there that do just use 200 for everything.
Yeah.
And one of the aims of we haven't really got a mission statement yet, but one of the things that we've sort of hinted at being the mission statement is to, rather than saying what should be the case, saying what is the case. So basically, is that the right direction, or should we be writing a spec about what should be the case more so than what is the case?
My sense is that if it's a spec, it should be about what should be the case. Now, obviously, you need to pin that in reality. So one way to think about this is there exists some unwritten spec out there that is what you're talking about, that just describes what everyone is doing. And then by migrating from that to a thing that is what we want, you're introducing breaking changes. So maybe it's still worthwhile to write something. You don't have to necessarily call it a spec. You can just call it research, something like that. Like, here's a documentation of the various ways GraphQL is being used over HTTP. The nice thing about being honest about it being documentation and describing what is happening rather than what we want to be happening is that you can like write, when it says, here's one potential way to use GraphQL, you can say, that's the Shopify way. Shopify does it that way. Oh, and Facebook does it this slightly different way. And you can make it clear. So when you're looking back at that research, you know exactly, okay, if we broke that, who are the people we should go talk to first to figure out how to do a migration? That way, when we're writing out a spec, that's like, if you're writing a brand new GraphQL server, here's the spec that you should try to abide by that gives the most value to clients. When we do that, we'll start to see a delta between the two. And then we'll need to resolve all those deltas. We'll need to be able to say, okay, that's a private API. Who cares? As long as your clients are happy with their private API, what value you're getting ascribing to the spec anyway. If it's public APIs, you'll either have to say like, those are vendor specific oddities for historical reasons will stick around, or here's a migration path, or actually this one is not possible because the way that you've spec'd it is completely counter to the way it works in practice. So having that research will still be valuable to inform that. But I do think that at some point we're going to want to do that, right? Like if it's not now, it might be next year where we're like, okay, we've had this GraphQL HTTP spec for a while, but it documented what was, it doesn't document what we want. So now we want to do what we want. And now we realize like, oh crap, we got to do all these breaking changes. And all these new people have built on top of this spec. I think the earlier you address the breaking changes for this minimal set, the easier it's going to be to iterate on top of that in the future. Even if that means being honest about the things that are in and not in that do and don't match the spec in existing use cases. And one of those might be status codes.
So I agree, that's what I would rather do. So I'm glad you're on the same page. I will present this to the GraphQL HTTP working group and we'll go from there. How do we get access to this recording, by the way?
It's a great question. Once I hit stop, it goes into some netherworld where it spins and says waiting. And I believe at some point it stops and then I get a link. So I'll figure that out. Originally, what we were trying to do was we just get like a movie file. And so it's hard to put it in a place where people can get to it. The goal was to put that on YouTube, but YouTube requires a lot of verification to upload anything longer than a couple of minutes. And these are usually more than an hour.
It's actually pretty easy, but Zoom will not send you an email. You have to go to the Zoom website because we are recording our stand-ups for Hot Chocolate. So you go to the Zoom website, there's a recordings section, and after 2 or 3 days, usually you can download the recordings. But because now everybody is using Zoom for online meetings in the Corona crisis, it takes sometimes a week or 1.5. But then you can download it, and this file you can pretty easy upload directly to YouTube. You can also, but this you need to pre-set up, directly stream that to YouTube. So you could directly stream that meeting to YouTube, and it would then, after it is finished, persist immediately.
Yeah, the missing piece, and Brian has reached out to YouTube to try to figure out how to get ahead of this, is that we need a YouTube account that is
exactly
has some there's like a flag that limits how much you can upload, and it's limited both in terms of the number of videos you can upload per week and the length of those, and that the length is the thing that's been killing us, because it's relatively short and these meetings tend to be pretty long, so we haven't been able to upload any of them yet. So I promise we will resolve this. There's some way to do it. And if like worst comes to worst, we'll just put up like a box account and like stick all the video files in the box account. But we'll find some way to do it.
I'm back on the HTTP status code things. I'm happy to talk now or later, Benji, about like why Shopify has done 200s for everything and kind of what challenges and advantages we've seen with that. So I'm
generally curious. So yeah, we can talk about it now.
Yeah. So one of the biggest things was there's a bunch of kinds of errors where it's not always clear to the client whether that is an error inside the execution of the query or outside the execution of the query. Throttling is a big one because in fact, it depends. It can be both. And which one of those it is not something the client really cares about. So we didn't want it to like, oh, okay, you got a throttle error. And in this case, we gave you a 429 because that was a throttle that happened outside of query execution. And in this case, we gave you a throttle there, but we didn't give you a 429 because it happened inside client query execution. And then the second half of that is that if there are things that happen inside of query execution, obviously you can have multiple errors, they can have multiple status codes. Which one do you pick? If this feels
the whole multiple errors thing is why we've basically said as soon as you get as far as actually executing the query, then it's a 200. Even if you've got all those errors, that is a 200. It's more the if I can't even attempt to execute the query, rate limiting, for example, or forbidden errors or things like that. That's where we're thinking that there are status codes, but you're effectively saying for Shopify, you're like, no, that's fine. It's still a GraphQL issue. We're just going to add it to the errors list, right? But you still would not have the data entry for that. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a bunch of places in our code right now where we rescue exceptions outside of the GraphQL execution engine, and then hard code return 200 with this JSON body that looks like GraphQL, because that is the kind of the most convenient for the client in terms of at a later point, we could move that check into the GraphQL execution engine if we wanted to be more fine-grained about it, and the payload response wouldn't change.
Is there a problem with returning non-200s if there's a syntax error? So say someone submits a query to you that's just like missing a bunch of close braces or something. Is returning non-200 problematic?
No, I think that like that specific case, we could probably return non-200 fairly consistently and easily.
Just still returning a GraphQL error. And that's why we also always use 200, because you still have always the same shape. And if you get a status code, or at least it's like that now, if you get a status code like 400, that's something out of the GraphQL context. So you don't get a guaranteed GraphQL response, or that's how I thought about it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And sorry, this is Gabriel McAdams at PayPal. We're doing that exact thing. There are certain situations that we don't return a 200, that being authentication or obviously 500s. And in these cases, we aren't returning a GraphQL error at all. We're just returning an HTTP status code. And we figured that not only helps our monitoring of errors, because looking into the GraphQL errors is costly, but it also helps in those more obvious cases where it's not even related to GraphQL. And what Lee brought up with respect to the syntax problems, that in itself is not really a GraphQL error either. That's a problem with the request. And so that would be a 4XX.
Yeah, and I think I checked, like Shopify might actually at this point not return a 200 GraphQL error for syntax errors. It might just return a 4XX, as we do like for authentication and stuff that happens outside of like at the Nginx layer or even higher in the stack. Like we can return 200s and GraphQLs for that. It's a bad request and we kick it out before it even gets to the server that knows what GraphQL means.
I agree with the parsing errors, but validation is, I think about validation is already a part of the GraphQL execution. So validating a query for something, I think a 400 is too strong, because then we wouldn't look into the GraphQL errors, because you're building up all those validation results, and validation is not only the spec validation. Actually, people can write their own validation rules on top of that. And so I'm a bit concerned about that.
We draw the line at, for the syntax errors, we draw the line at whether we were able to parse the query at all.
Yeah,
if we can't do anything with it because of the structure being impossible to parse, then it's not a GraphQL error. Once we can get into the resolvers, then it becomes a GraphQL error.
Yeah, it's not necessarily the resolvers. It's once we, or at least it's for us. So once we trigger the validation, so that is still
yeah
200 for us.
I was conflating the two, but yeah, you're more accurate.
Yeah.
So this basically all harkens back to what I was saying before with the whole issue of if it's a non-200, then we can't trust the response because we don't know it's definitely a GraphQL error. Hence why we're discussing the whole media types in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think that responding with a 200 with errors is perfectly a valid thing to do, which is why we basically stated that a GraphQL server that only returns 200s is valid. That said, some clients, many people would prefer that we used non-200 status codes to represent things like, invalid queries, validation failed. That is, as one of you said, sorry, I forget who, that is a client error, right? The client has submitted something to the server that's just literally not valid. And so it shouldn't even reach the GraphQL execution engine. But what Michael says about this is also valid, which is, well, the response to it will also tell you where that went wrong, where that validation went wrong. And that is in a GraphQL specific response format. If you return a 400, it might just be a straight up HTML page going, nah, or it might be a JSON object saying, here is the issue. It's at this field location or this length and position or whatever. And I think this is actually quite an interesting and problematic thing because it is not clear which direction is correct. And what we were planning to do with the HTTP spec currently is basically say, they're both correct, whatever. But like Lee wants to be more strict, which I think is sensible, but it also does introduce this almost the need for the media status code. Otherwise, you can't know that you can then process the response.
I now understand why you've arrived at the MIME type being the critical thing to discuss. I'm 100% on board with what you originally pitched now, which is my desire would be if you get a 200, that means that you got to query execution and like some amount of that succeeded. There could still be an errors field in the payload, but like you have a non-null data field. If you have a non-null data field, you get a 200. Everything else, that indicates that either there was a problem with the query itself, or it indicates that the server failed to fulfill your query completely, in which case it shouldn't be 200 anymore. That last bit I can see more debate on, but the previous bits I think are pretty clear cut. Like if you have a syntax error, I can't see why that would be a 200.
Yeah.
If you have an invalid query that like technically it doesn't have a syntax error, but it's nonsensical, it can't be executed, I also can't see why we should be returning 200 for that. But I completely agree that like, especially once you start layering other HTTP services on these things, you have to know how to interpret these non-200s, and it seems like MIME type is exactly the right way to do that. And like, don't try to parse HTML as JavaScript or JSON or GraphQL JSON. You're gonna have a bad time. Does that totally bust up what you guys were talking about, Gabe and Evan?
Yeah, definitely. It's all about drawing the line between GraphQL and not.
So there's this other question of knowing, was your error within GraphQL or was it not within GraphQL? Does having the MIME type suffice for that, to be able to see it's non-200, but the MIME type of the non-200 response is application GraphQL plus JSON?
I came in a little late. I'm not sure what you're referring to with the MIME type.
Sorry, that was the original impetus for this discussion,
Okay.
was introducing like what the status of these various MIME types that we've suggested in the past, and if we would need something for the response specifically that includes, that lets you know whether the payload is the data errors extensions response that you would expect. So I think that this is where the tricky bit has come in the past, is you want to know, should I be interpreting this response as a JSON payload that has a data field, an errors field, an extensions field? And the only way that we've been able to interpret that so far is if it's a 200, then yes. And if it's not 200, then probably no. And I think what we're learning here is that that's probably conflated and not quite right. And so if we're going to say that that's not the right thing, then what is? And Benji's suggestion was a MIME type.
Okay, yeah, so that is very similar to what we're doing at PayPal. We don't have a common header in use. We have one we just created for this purpose, but it's doing exactly that. We look at that header to determine if we need to look into the payload to find the errors or not.
Interesting. A header is also, I think, an interesting way to approach this. I know sometimes people get grumpy if you add in custom headers, but you could have a custom header that just describes the kind of error.
Or just straight up like x-is-GraphQL, you know.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what we have. But MIME type is a header too, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's a standard content type header rather than, I mean, it needs an RFC process rather than an x- header, which does not.
Yeah.
Also, x- is not anymore. It's obsolete now. You shouldn't x- your headers anymore.
To say that, but everybody does it anyway.
Yes, it's outlawed by the RFC.
The fun thing about the internet is you can't outlaw anything.
Yeah, but they say it's basically deprecated to do it. It's just.
Yeah, we should not continue on the path if it's not what's ideal.
I want to mention that it's actually a good idea to study prior art, because, for example, SWAP have a MIME type. As far as I remember, it have MIME type, and they didn't bother to add it into MIME database, but it's like in SWAP spec, and it's like application swap plus XML or something similar. I don't remember exactly. And I also, if I remember correctly, gRPC have its own MIME type, and they also, as far as I know, don't put it in MIME database. So putting something inside the official database is kind of secondary goal. It's not preventing us from using MIME types. And like, there is prior art for RPC mechanisms for SWAP and gRPC, so I don't see why we cannot use it. Plus, MIME types give you some additional benefits like content negotiation. You can ask server, do you support GraphQL, and server will answer, yeah, I support GraphQL. MIME types also have like parameters. So for example, you can specify that, I don't know, like we agree not to version GraphQL, but like maybe you can pass like version or some additional argument. For existing formats, people are using it for encoding, to specify that like type of encoding of a payload. So I think like MIME types are actually the right choice because it's already existing ecosystem, even for like Express server or like servers in other languages. There is like body parsers, and people will implement body parser for GraphQL instead of like doing something custom with like looking at the header. You just like add one more case inside the switch saying if it's MIME type is GraphQL, you should react like that. If it's like SWAP, you should react like that.
That's a good point, and relates back to what you're talking before about the process can be long, and once it's there, you can't really change it very easily. The Ietf RFCs, that seems like the very last step what we should do rather than one of the first steps. Content negotiation is also an interesting way to handle the thing that Rob was talking about of knowing what a server can and can't support. Doesn't completely contain everything that could entail, but certainly just knowing, like, does it support the get mode or the post mode, or accepting application GraphQL directly, or this like mixed JSON payload content negotiation is like a tried and true way to handle that. So I think that's pretty interesting too.
I definitely like approaches that will open the door to future things as well. For example, if we just used a is GraphQL header, then that restricts its usage to just that. But if we allowed something a little more broad, then we can have multiple responses for different use cases without with only one change.
Yeah.
One limitation of MIME type is about content. It should be about content, because it's not even tied to transport mechanism. It's like what content you're sending. It should not describe how you're sending it. So yeah, we can use content negotiation or other mechanisms to document payload. We cannot use MIME types to content negotiate if server support get or post, because that way we limit it to HTTP, because MIME types are universal, they can be used over other transports. So I think it's excellent solution for describing payloads, but not a way how you send payload. So
that's a good point.
And one more aspect. I also thought about MIME types and is it useful or not. And one thing it's useful for is application GraphQL, actually useful for SDL schemas. And we can finally have official suffix for file names. Like people more or less standardize on .graphql, and like operation system associate extension with MIME type with application to open it, so it will help IDEs and other stuff. So I also think application GraphQL is useful, not as useful as like request and response, documenting request and response, but also useful to document that with like file on your disk is actually something in GraphQL format.
That's a great point. Benji, I feel like you got more than you paid for in terms of input on the HTTP stuff. How are you feeling about it?
Yeah, that was certainly a very long 5 minutes. I do apologize for massively underestimating that.
No problem. Anything else you want to cover on this? Otherwise, Benji organizes these HTTP meetings. Probably another good opportunity to set up a channel in our Slack. I think this is something I'd love to start doing more of in general, is a subcommittee, or whether it's an RFC that's just an ongoing RFC, we should just set up a channel and have active conversation about it there. Be a good excuse for us to spend more time in that Slack in a focused way.
Cool. I'm not actually one of the organizers of the HTTP Spec working group, but I am one of the contributors to it.
Great. Who's organizing it? Ivan?
So like I started it, but right now,
Sam Parsons, right?
Yeah, yes, Sam helps a lot. So I kind of like, it was, as I said before, it was crazy month. So I missed last 2 working groups, GraphQL or HTTP working groups, and before I was in it. So Sam did a great job of stepping it up and not allowing working group to die. I give him admin rights on the repo, so he's able to do all administrative work and coordinate people and create agendas. So yeah, he's basically responding. And I think I will definitely come to next one, especially since there is like topics about status codes and like, thing that I'm interested in, deeply interested in. So, but right now it's mostly controlled by Sam, and I think it's a good situation. We need more people in the core team and more people taking responsibility for stuff, for different stuff.
I just made a group for us in Slack, just called HTTP. Feel free to add folks there.
There's already a channel for it in Slack.
Oh, there is?
Yeah, already. GraphQL over HTTP.
Oh, man. Well,
it's not so active, but it's a little active.
Oh, yeah, so there is. Okay, well, we can keep that one. I'll just delete the one I made. Cool. Anything else on this topic? Yuri, I saw you mention additional agenda items. Now is usually the time where we're out of agenda items, and I ask if there's anything else we want to cover while we're all here.
Yeah, I think the first one was covered already, like about like uploading to YouTube the meetings. And the second one is just about, we just saw that GraphQL JS 15 got released, and I wonder if, I don't know, maybe you talked about it already in the beginning of the meeting about what's next, and also in terms of the TypeScript migration, and if we can help somehow.
Yeah,
and if it's also the right place to talk about it, like maybe we can just take it for later.
Yeah, we can create one more channel, GraphQL JS. I don't know if
yeah.
there is
okay.
one for that, but core idea is have a stable version. We actually need, I think we need to coordinate, because you're responsible, the guild responsible for a bunch of models, including GraphQL tools recently, and we need to coordinate release plan. What version we support, for how long, and what guarantees we provide. So like, especially since now people actually discovering security vulnerabilities in GraphQL JS. It's mostly like denial of service attacks, but still like we need to coordinate what we support and release plan. But I think, yeah, it's outside of this group because it's like multi-language, not only JavaScript. So yeah, we can coordinate on a channel, and if you want, we can create a call. I have access to Zoom, so I can to GraphQL Foundation Zoom, so I can schedule a call for that.
Great, thank you. We would love to be part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I will ask Apollo guys if they're interested or not, and we can discuss agenda. I think like we actually need to start communicating more, because yeah.
Great. Anything else anyone wants to cover while we're here?
I want to point that even though this time we have a really short agenda, it still takes us 2 hours. So like agenda can be short or long, but it's almost always 2 hours.
Sorry.
Yeah, I see that as a good thing. It means that we have a good cadence of work. We're still slightly under. Sometimes I think more often we go a little bit over 2 hours. This time we're a bit under. Okay, well then I can wrap up the meeting. Thanks everybody. This is healthy discussion. I feel like we made pretty good progress on a lot of stuff. As always, come back to this GraphQL Slack to continue ongoing discussion. Otherwise, I'll see you back here next month.
Thanks all.
Thanks everyone.
See ya.
Thanks. See you guys.
Thanks. Take care.
Wow.